Right, hello and good morning everyone. Welcome to this webinar with Erwin Mitchell. Today we're going to be looking at relationships and capacity to consent, and this has been put together by the National Children's Serious Injury Group at Erwin Mitchell. So we're very glad you managed to join us this morning. Just do a few introductions first, if I may. I'm Stephen Cardinal. I'm a Senior Associate at Erwin Mitchell in Sheffield doing public law. Our main speaker today is Dr. Catriona McIntosh, who's a consultant clinical neuropsychologist from Yorkshire Neuropsychology, and she's going to be giving our sort of main talk today. But we've got a panel for you to deal with some questions and answers at the end, and there's also a breakout session. So also on our panel is Carolyn Heaton, who's a partner of our serious injury team in Leeds. And we've also got Lucy Clement, who's an associate in our Southampton office, also doing public law. So we're going to be doing the questions and answers with you after the main talk. Just for a bit of housekeeping before we start. I understand you can submit questions through our questions and answers function on your screens. We're going to be dealing with the questions probably at the end of Catriona's main talk, but there's also a breakout session which is on a separate invite, which you're more than welcome to attend after the main session. So don't miss that. Right. Well, I think that probably deals with all the formalities. So perhaps I could hand over to Catriona for the main talk. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Catriona.
It's messing up. Can anyone hear me now? It's the control. Oh, brilliant. I can see you nodding, Stephen. Sorry, the control wasn't responding properly. So apologies for that technical problem, everyone. My name's Catriona. I'm a neuropsychologist working for the Disabilities Trust, Brain Injury Unit down near Yorath in Leeds, but also I run Yorkshire Neuropsychology. And really pleased to be here today talking to you about relationships and capacity to consent. If we can move on the slide, please. So today we're going to be looking at some of the legal frameworks for what capacity for sexual relationships is and some of the relevant case law. We're going to be looking at some other capacity issues that are also relevant alongside capacity for sex, such as social media and capacity for contact, i.e. relationships. And we're going to think about how do we apply that clinically. So sort of difficulties that people might get after having had a TBI, thinking about our own emotional responses on this topic, about staff support needs, people's family needs as well. How do we might meet this as a rehab goal and how do we apply it in rehab? And you may not have come across something called the TLC Trust, but they're an organisation that support people to access sex workers who have disabilities. And I've had a conversation with Beverly from there, and I'd like to share with some of the discussion we had. And finally, looking at some issues relevant to transition ages and collaborations with family. What I'm not covering today is actually the how to do capacity assessments. I'm hoping most of you are familiar with that, but those principles of ability to comprehend they all apply in this work. And we're not going to look at marriage as well because of timeframes. Are we okay to move on now? Okay, so many of you will be familiar with the Mental Capacity Act, but it is worth being aware that there's two frameworks for assessing capacity for sex. The one we usually will use is the civil law test of under the Mental Capacity Act and associated case law. So this is the majority of situations, but it is for when a criminal offence is not suspected, and we'll focus on this today. We won't cover it, but just be aware there is an act under the Sexual Offences Act, and if the police are considering or pursuing a prosecution in the criminal court, you should be using this test. They're very similar, but one of the main differences is that the civil law test is not person specific, whereas under the Sexual Offences Act you are considering specifically about an individual. So if you have been asked to do a capacity assessment for sex, do make sure with your instructing party that you know which framework is appropriate for the scenario. And it is maybe worth being aware, British Psychological Society do recommend you keep up with case law when doing capacity assessments generally, but also for sexual capacity assessments. So we are going to cover some of the relevant case law today. And they also recommend to follow some of those updates. The ones provided by Essex Street Chambers are excellent, and I would agree with that. They're really helpful. Next slide, please. Okay, so capacity consent for sex. Historically, the bar is set very low on this. And when I say the bar, what I mean is the relevant knowledge base is quite basic. It's a low bar. In 2004, Justice Mumby set it out as an understanding of the mechanics of sex, the basic foreseeable consequences, such as pregnancy and STDs, and that the person needs to understand it's their choice and they can refuse. And that's it at that point. And this in part came from a history of restrictions for people with intellectual disorders. There previously were viewpoints that people should not be having sex, that they should be sterilised if you had an intellectual disorder. And the response to that is that recognising that this is one of our human rights under the European Convention, and that also many people don't think sexual decisions through. So it should be quite a low bar required for this decision. It is important to note, though, if someone lacks capacity, consent cannot be given, capacity for sex, consent cannot be given on that person's behalf. Sometimes I do encounter people saying, well, that means we can't assess it, or we can't put support in. We can't do a support plan if it's for capacity for sex. And actually, that's not the case. We simply can't consent to someone having sex on their behalf, which is logical, really. We can't do that routinely anyway. But we absolutely can assess this, and we can put support plans in for any support needs. Next slide, please. Okay. So most people who have had sex previously or sex education at some point in their life will meet this bar. So almost everybody I assess has capacity for sex because it is so basic. Alongside that, just want to point out that this benchmark, you do need to be aware that age of consent is 16. However, some sexual activities such as purchasing, pornographic videos, using sex worker sites often have an 18+ requirement. So there are some idiosyncrasies around this as well. And if you're doing assessments in this field, I would strongly recommend the BPS guidance. It's really helpful. So in June 2020, there was a rethink on all of this. Sorry, Theo, we've moved on a slide, if that's okay. There we go. And it was proposed that we might have been getting this wrong all along. So historically, can we go back? There we go. Historically, it's always been phrased as, does P, the person, have capacity to consent to sex? And this phrasing puts a focus on someone's ability to say yes or no to another. And I'd almost suggest that this is another hangover from views of someone with a learning disability might be a passive recipient of sex, i.e. they're at risk of abuse. They have to say yes or no to someone instigating it with them, rather than them being their own sexual person with their own needs who might instigate sex with other person, and that they might need to consider their partner's ability to consent as well. So this is a complete change. So if we can just do the next slide, please. So the case of JB in the Court of Appeal reframed this, and this was a 36-year-old man with a complex diagnosis of autism. And what was interesting about this case is the phrasing changed over time. So initially the question before the judge was actually said, does this person, in order to have capacity to consent to relations, must understand that the other person must consent? Oh, sorry, can we go back? There we go, thanks. And initially, Mrs. Justice Roberts found that the relevant information did not include that JB did not have to understand that the other person should consider, he had to consider the other person had to consent. The local authority appealed, and they said that Judge Roberts had been wrong to exclude this information. So can we do the next slide? So Lord Justice Baker then got involved and had a different viewpoint. Have we missed a slide? I'm sorry, they're moving around a little bit. I'm lost track. No, it is the next slide. Sorry, there we go. So Lord Justice Baker held a different view. Oh, there we go. He said that when the decision is expressed in those terms, it becomes clear that the information relevant to the decision inevitably includes the fact that any person with whom P engages in sexual activity must be able to consent to such activity and does in fact consent to it. Sexual relations between human beings are mutually consensual. It is one of the many features that make us unique. A person who does not understand that sexual relations must only take place when, and only for as long as the other person is consenting, is unable to understand a fundamental part of the information relevant to the decision whether or not to engage in such relations. So you can see here we've shifted from a perspective of saying, does P consent, to saying, does P have capacity to consent to sexual relations with someone else? And it really does respond to this idea that someone with an impaired decision making is not just a passive recipient of sexual activity, but is can be an instigator as well, and it's a relationship. And my thoughts are that this judgment is about time, but also it's really in keeping with societal views and the impact of Me Too, that actually we have to consider someone's capacity. And if someone says no, it's important that that person understands that that has to be respected during sex. Next slide, please. So Justice Baker has set out a new criteria for sexual capacity. And this criteria says that when, as a result of impairment or disturbance in mind or brain, a person is unable to understand, retain, use or weigh information relevant to a decision, the information that's relevant is the sexual nature of the act, including the mechanics, the fact that the other person must have the capacity to consent to the sexual activity and must consent, the fact that P can say yes or no and decide whether to give or withhold consent, the reasonable foreseeable consequences of sex, such as pregnancy and HIV as well, and that those risks can be reduced by taking precautions like a condom. So it's still a very low bar, but we now need to consider the person's ability to consider other people's wishes and consent. Next slide, please. So it is important to be aware that the decisions are that sex is about the nature of the act and the identity of the sexual partner is not relevant. And just as Mumby said, a woman either has capacity to consent to normal penetrative vaginal intercourse or she does not. It is difficult to see how it can sensibly be said that she has the capacity to consent to a particular sexual act with Y, while at the same time lacking capacity to consent to precisely the same sexual act with Z. Capacity to consent to sexual intercourse does not depend on an understanding of sexual intercourse with a particular person. Put shortly, capacity to consent to sexual relations is issue specific, it is not person specific. This is slightly controversial. Not everyone, I think, agree. You know, there's been mixed case law on this, so people sometimes having concerns about the particular identity of someone who puts someone at risk. But the current criteria is, just as Mumby said, it is not person specific. What is relevant is the nature of the type of sex. So, for instance, a person would only need to understand something like vaginal penis sex or anal sex, depending on their sexual orientation. They wouldn't need to understand all forms of sex. And they don't need to understand the risk of pregnancy if the person's postmenopausal or gay. So it really is very basic information that's relevant to their personal situation. Next slide, please. What's not relevant? I would suggest that for people working in this field, understanding what's not relevant is actually almost more important than what is, because this is sometimes people are quite surprised by this. So the courts have said we do not need to have an accurate understanding of the risks of pregnancy. For instance, 2016, Judge Parker ruled a person who believed pregnancy could only occur within marriage was not adequate to displace the presumption of capacity. The person does not need to be able to use contraception. They just need to know that contraception can prevent the risks, but they don't need to be able to put that into effect. They do not need to understand the social and emotional consequences of pregnancy, what's involved in caring for a child, to be able to care for any child, or have to weigh that any children may be removed from their care. So it's worth being aware that what some people assume might be relevant to this decision is, in legal circles, not relevant. So we need to be very careful we don't over include information in this assessment. Next slide, please. What about ability to use and weigh? I think this is quite important because in working in brain injury, many of us are very used to focusing on this because many of our clients with brain injury, particularly if they're going to fail a capacity assessment, often struggle on the use and weigh component. And furthermore, we consider the frontal lobe paradox a lot. The frontal lobe paradox, for anyone not familiar with it, refers to a difficulty that sometimes people, particularly in brain injury, can have, that they might say one thing but be unable to apply it to their behaviour. So they might be able to talk the talk but not walk the walk. But the courts are clear that actually this is of less relevance in sexual capacity. The below quote is specifically about sexual capacity, it's not about capacity in general. But Dan Radcliffe, in this excellent book, I highly recommend people buy and read it, says the ability of the individual to exercise capacity to give consent to sex in real life situations is not relevant for the purposes of determining capacity. While concerns regarding this are legitimate and raise questions of ongoing support and risk management, they are not a reason to conclude the person lacks capacity. It's quite astounding that, isn't it? And furthermore, weighing up is not an irrelevant consideration, but is unlikely to loom large in the evaluation of capacity to consent to sexual relationships. Case law indicates that people do not often decide to have sex after weighing up all the considerations, and the decision is largely visceral, owing more to instinct and emotion than analysis. And we should not hold higher standards for people with capacity than without. So in the same way that people might have a few drinks in the pub and go home with someone and not think through it, in detail, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? Am I going to regret it tomorrow? That this sometimes isn't a decision that people think through, and that's why the case law reflects that. Next slide, please. And indeed, a survey back in 2009 found for British young people with no brain injury here, that 61% had said that they'd had sex, and 43% who were sexually active admitted to having sex with a new partner without using any contraception. Factors raised as to why that was they said they were drunk, their partner didn't wish to use contraception, and some of them said that they didn't want to use condoms or hormonal methods and didn't have education on alternative methods as well. Next slide, please. And I guess I don't need everyone's answers here, but who hasn't made an unwise sexual decision at some point in their life? The intention of the act is not to dress an incapacitated person in forensic cotton wool, but to allow them as far as possible to make the same mistakes that all other human beings are at liberty to make, and not infrequently do. I would almost go as far as saying, is this a healthy part of growing up? We learn about relationships with trial and error, we make mistakes, we do that, I think most people do that, and maybe we had the luxury that our decisions and mistakes hopefully had a bit more privacy to them. And Justice Mumby said once, what good is it making someone safer if it merely makes them miserable? Next slide, please. What I would like to raise today is that capacity is decision specific, and I would suggest that in some of the cases I've come across, it's not unusual for concerns of other people not to actually be about the sex bit, but actually to be about someone's vulnerability in relationships and their ability to keep themselves safe. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes this is not one decision, and it's not just about capacity for sex. It might involve consideration of capacity to draw upon things like someone's capacity to decide around their alcohol consumption, their social media use, finances, or contact. So we can actually separate these out as separate capacity assessments. And it's worth considering that the bar for those decisions is often higher. So we might well need support plans around someone's dating or sexual needs, even though that they have capacity for the sexual act. Next slide, please. So capacity for sexual relationships is act specific, but capacity for contact with another person is treated as person specific. So this means we can assess someone's ability to make informed decisions around somebody they want to meet up with, for instance. And the case of TZ is relevant here. And this was a gentleman with a mild learning disability who was assessed as having capacity to sex, but he lacked capacity to determine whether the person he wished to have sex with was safe, or to decide on the support required to keep him safe when having contact with a sexual partner. So we actually have a situation legally where someone can be deemed to have the ability to consent to the sexual act, but not to choose their partner. Slightly unusual set of events, perhaps. But it does mean if we have concerns that someone is making risky decisions around people they're seeing without ability to weigh, retain, comprehend or communicate the relevant information, we can consider capacity for contact as well as sex, and it allows maybe a bit more room for looking at support plans. And I guess the take-home message there is just because a client has capacity for sexual relationships does not mean we can't put support in place. And many clients welcome this, and families can feel less anxious with this. You also may need to refer a complex case here to the court protection for guidance of whether restrictions are okay or not. It is a tricky area, I think, here when we're making those restrictions. Next slide, please. So the relevant information for capacity for contact is that you must know who the person is, the nature of the relationship and the type of contact, the pros, the cons of that contact. They must know what a family relationship is, and it's different to other categories of contact, and whether the person with whom contact's being considered has prior convictions and is a risk or not, and weighing of those risks. What is not important is things that we don't need to consider risks that are not relevant. So what I mean by that is if the proposed contact person, if there was no concerns around financial abuse, we would not involve consideration of financial abuse as one of those risks. We'd only look at risks relevant to contact to that person that's being proposed. Next slide, please. Maybe not a question, but I'm going to say to you, what is sex? I would suggest that the sexual capacity requirements focus on quite a basic idea of sex as penetrative sex. Oh, we've lost slides. Oh, we're back. It's quite a sort of concrete concept of sex, and actually maybe sexual relationships have changed over the years. We know, especially in COVID, there's an increase in meeting people over the internet, an increase in sexting, so sending sexually explicit contact to each other on the internet, increased concern that young people are requested to send sexual images over the internet. And does our court definition of capacity sex encompass what sex can be now? I don't know if it does. So this raises possibility that someone may have capacity for a sexual act in person, physically, but may not have capacity to manage sexually based communication on the internet. They are legally two different things. Next slide, please. So social media use was clarified in 2 linked judgments in 2019 by Justice Cobb, who outlined it. And just have a look at these slides and note that they're actually more substantial than the requirements for sexual capacity. Next slide, please. So relevant information is that images or information you share on the internet could be shared more widely, that you can limit the sharing of this information using privacy settings, that if you place information which is rude or offensive, that people could be upset, that people you communicate with may not be who they say they are, that some people who you don't know on the internet may pose a risk to you and they may take advantage of you sexually, and that if you look at extremely rude or offensive images, you may get in trouble with the police because you committed a crime. Next slide, please. He says to clarify that, they don't need to know the precise mechanisms of privacy settings, that they use the context of sharing as sending, such as an email or a file, and they clarify rude as offensive as sending sexually explicit information. Quite an important point there, okay? Next slide, please. He also clarifies that what's not relevant is he recognises that the internet is addictive and that accessing legal but extreme pornography, for instance, can lead a viewer to develop a distorted view of healthy human relationships and can be compulsive. But actually many people don't consider that risk, so that's not relevant. But that could be quite important for some of our clients, couldn't it, who have a distorted view of sexual interactions from pornography on the internet. Next slide, please. Similarly, there's guidance on pornography, and the Sexual Offences Act says it's a crime to cause a person with a mental disorder to watch a sex act. So it's really important if someone in our care is accessing pornography, we give some consideration of whether they have capacity, because they must have capacity around that for it not to be an offence. The BPS sets out some guidance on this in their sexual guidance, saying that pornography is pictures of sexual acts that are normally private, that this involves people understanding that these people are pretending and people do not necessarily behave like this in real life, that some people are upset by this and it should be a private act, that pornography is not illegal, but it would be against the law to look at anything involving children, sex with animals or hurting people, and you should not show this to other people without asking them first, and you should not show it to children. Next slide, please. So we've covered some of the legal framework and judgments in the last few years around sexual capacity, and I'm going to move on to some thoughts of applying this into rehab now, if that's okay. So what sort of difficulties might someone have with their sexual needs more broadly? Because capacity is quite a specific thing. Let's think about sexual needs in the wider sense. Can we go back, please? And sometimes after a brain injury, someone might have problems with disinhibition. So someone might masturbate in public. I've had people walking down the corridors naked. They might just say comments they wouldn't have said previously, or, you know, I really like your breasts, for instance. So that mental filter might have a few holes in it and things might come out that aren't appropriate. And if that's happening, that can make it harder to form relationships with people. We know brain injury can reduce people's sexual drive, and it can reduce drive generally. If someone's adynamic and lying in bed all day, then they might not be having much opportunity to interact with other people. It can cause physical changes. It can change erectile functioning. It can change physical coordination, such as apraxia, tremor, hemiparesis, so someone's ability to use their body. But it can also change your body image. If you've got a facial droop, scarring, a craniotomy, many of our service users increase weight after a brain injury. You know, if your body has changed, how you feel about your body might also have changed, and whether you feel as attractive to other people anymore might have altered. A real big one for me that I think is really important is social cognition, and this refers to people's ability to read others' emotional states, understand their thoughts and perspectives. And if you can't read that someone is maybe turned on or not and say, I'm really not in the mood, that can cause problems. If you can't read that your partner is sad and respond with a hug, that can link to relationship breakdown. And, you know, alongside this, personality changes can happen after a brain injury. If someone is lacking empathy now and not thinking about someone else's needs as much, relationships can break down and divorce rates are high after a brain injury. But it can also change the nature of a relationship. If you're changing your partner's catheter bag, washing and dressing them, you might feel, and recently a wife talked to me about feeling she's resenting being in a carer role and not being a wife. And it's hard for anything to happen in that relationship. Privacy can reduce. If you've got 2 carers in your house 24 hours a day, may not feel like a private home. Continence, a catheter might be attached to your leg at all times. You might have a pad preventing access to your genitalia. You might have a sheath on to urinate into. And all those things mean that sex or sexual acts might need to be planned rather than spontaneous. And if you need to ask someone to take off a pad every time you want to masturbate, it might just not be happening as much as it used to in the past. You also might be judged on your sexual choices that may longer have privacy. One of our service users recently shared her sexual choices, and another service user was very critical of that. He felt that this was very inappropriate, and that wasn't right that happened, but there's a lack of privacy here, and sometimes people's sexual choices may not be what others agree with. People might be anxious, especially after stroke and aneurysms. Some people are asking me, is it safe? I'm nervous of any exercise right now. Is it safe for me to have sex? People might be anxious about their decision making, and staff might be anxious. Are we doing the right thing? Lawyers might be anxious. Can we do this? Is this okay? Is this not okay? You know, people get nervous about this stuff. But alongside this, imagine if you're 18 and you thought you had a future of going to university, training, getting a job, meeting a partner, getting married, having kids. You've got a sort of idea in your head of how you see your life going. And actually, you've been hit by a car, your life has been turned upside down. Right here, right now, you feel that you might never meet someone and nobody will ever want you. And there might be a lot of grief for the life that you feel that you've lost right now. So psychological adjustment over time for seeing people going through things you're not going through, and that can change over time. You know, initially things might be okay, but then, you know, you're at school with all your friends, and then you see your friends forming relationships, you see them getting married and you're not. So this can be an ongoing process over time. This is a list that I just drew up, and I think my list initially was a lot longer. I couldn't fit it on this slide. The list could go on, but what I would say to you is that list covers an entire MDT. There's physio, there's SLT, there's psychologists, there's OTs, and I would say this is an MDT need to focus on in rehab. So alongside that, a brain injury might be the last thing on someone else's mind, and it might be the last thing on a professional's mind, especially in the acute stages. We might be focusing on keeping someone alive, helping them eat again, helping them walk again. But at what point is it time to think about this? And actually, brain injury changes over the time, and before we know it, 6 months have gone past, and actually, because it never occurred to us, nobody's asked this question. So it's very easy for it to not be covered in conversation when we're so focused on our day-to-day goals of helping people recover. So it now might be on the client's mind, but not talked about. Next slide, please. In line with this, Jenny Ponsford, a very well-known person in brain injury, did a survey in 2010. She found that up to half of people with a brain injury reported problems with sex after the brain injury, with people saying it was now reduced importance, reduced opportunities, they had reduced sex drive, they had reduced ability to give their partner satisfaction, they weren't enjoying it as much. They looked at the frequency of this in a control population, and brain injury people were reporting it was much higher. And those difficulties were then linked in with a high frequency of decreased self-confidence, reduced perceived sex appeal, higher depression, decreased communication levels and relationship quality with their partner. So this stuff is happening, and it has an impact on people's lives. Next slide, please. I'm showing my age here. I grew up with this song, Salt and Pepper, Let's Talk About Sex. Many of the younger people in the audience may have no idea what I'm talking about with that image, but never mind. But whose job is it? Who is talking about sex? And many people feel really nervous about doing capacity assessments generally. Many people feel unsure about clients talking about sex. You combine the two, who's having this conversation? It can be a hard conversation to have. Who's talking to family, with staff? And I would suggest we don't assume other people have had this conversation. I had a conversation with Pete Fleming, who I'm not sure if he's in the audience today, another neuropsychologist, and it was really interesting because he was saying he would assume the medics would have that conversation. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have assumed they have it. And actually, I think sometimes people assume I've had it and I don't always have it. You know, who's having this conversation? Do we have it if we already know it's an area of need? What about the people where we don't know? Do we ask people of the same sex, but not the opposite? You know, Pete said quite understandably, he said that in an expert case, if he's with a young female, he might feel that he might be perceived as a bit creepy suddenly asking about this on a one-off assessment with someone. You know, how do we feel we're talking about this with different people? How do we validate those feelings and think about ways around it so we make sure that this is being assessed? So I think it's important we consider our own emotional responses to that and what we're doing. Next slide, please. What about families? Well, in my work, I sometimes find that with a childhood brain injury, there might not be the same sort of normal separation from our parents that most of us develop in our teenage years. For many of us, our parents get used to seeing us with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and they gradually get used to us being sexual beings in our own right over time. It's not something they suddenly need to deal with overnight. And equally, our clients are more likely to be in a situation where family are used to providing higher amounts of support for a person than would be typical for their age. Family might be used to changing continence pads. They might be used to washing and dressing. So they're used to managing risks and being very involved in decisions and supporting that person. They might well have concerns that they'd be responsible if someone became pregnant. Sex can be a difficult conversation for people to have, and family and staff have their own values and beliefs around sex, and there can be misconceptions on who has the right to make decisions around this. It's an emotive area. Not surprisingly, Family members and staff generally do not have the knowledge that the bar for sexual relationships is so low, with little emphasis on the ability to think through and manage risks. So it's not surprising that people would assume, staff and families, that there would be greater safeguards for people they view as vulnerable. And this can be exacerbated because suddenly post 18 we've got issues of confidentiality. You know, the family might discover that their daughter's having sex and they're raising with us, and we're just saying, I'm really sorry, I cannot discuss this with you. The person wants it to be confidential. And there's, you know, it's a really tough time. Next slide, please. So communication and education are really important. If we can, it can help her to prepare in advance. If we know someone is growing up, can we raise this with family, saying that, you know, coming up there's going to be an increased right to privacy and how that might actually play out and some scenarios that could impact. We can help them understand that the legal framework is very different from the parental responsibility when the person was legally a child, and that the family have no right to make a decision in this field once the person's an adult. We can help them understand that legal situation of what sex is legally, and the impact of confidentiality. And maybe if we can, if the client gives permission, discuss the support plans, because that can be very reassuring after an initial shocked reaction of what might be happening, if they understand it in more depth and what support being in place. And actually they might be really on board with that then. Next slide, please. So as a case example, I was working with a 17-year-old woman of Pakistani ethnic origin, and she was actually sexually active prior to her brain injury, but she was commenced a sexual relationship in our brain injury rehabilitation unit here. We discovered that they were having sex, and we assessed both of their capacity, and both of them were deemed to have capacity, but we asked them, they both said they'd use condoms, and we asked them, would you mind just showing me how you'd use a condom? That's not part of their capacity assessment, just as an aside. They both had tremors and neither of them could use condoms safely. They couldn't put them on. So we put in some condom practice, and the relationship and the condom practice was kept confidential as per their wishes. The family found out, not through us, and they were really distressed, and you can understand why, but they raised concerns that their daughter they felt she should not be having sex after a brain injury, that this was not appropriate. They were concerned she would get pregnant. They were concerned that we had been way gone what we should be doing in rehab, that this psychologist was teaching their daughter how to have sex. And they had a solicitor who didn't understand, I think was not experienced, I think it's fair to say was not experienced in issues of capacity and had no brain injury expertise. I would say it highlighted to me why it's important to have a legal firm with brain injury expertise. And their solicitor was sending me letters challenging me with police on the work I was doing, which was quite stressful. But we had to go back to them and say to them, well, this is what capacity for sex is. This is the low bar. We're actually putting in measures to protect your daughter here by she's having sex anyway. We're teaching her how to use contraception to keep her safe, and we're following the law. People have the right to have sexual lives here. This is the framework we're working in. So it can be difficult situations here. And equally, currently I'm working on a case where the client now wants to extend the work they're doing with the support workers of accessing the community to going out on their own, but family have raised that this is not appropriate because she's not married. And the client, you know, respects the wishes of the family, and it's their culture, and we need to kind of maybe try and work with that family to think, where do they want her to end up? They want her to be able to access the community if she chooses to get married in the future, and there might need to be some bridging work so to support her to getting to that point, and how could we work collaboratively around that and understand different perspectives around that work. So this can be quite complex work. And it's tricky, and I think peer support is useful as well. Your colleagues and teamwork is really helpful around that. Next slide, please. I would also suggest we all have our own backgrounds and beliefs around sex and how comfortable we are talking about it. And it's very easy, whatever we may think we do, to actually make assumptions and be subtle differences on how we support people. So just stop and thinking about what we might be doing, what our team is doing, and whether we need any training in this. So these are real examples I've come across over the years of it being more common to ask men about libido post-TBI rather than women. assuming sexuality. So a manager was documenting that someone's sexuality was heterosexual on a DOLS form. And I said, oh, how do you know? I hadn't had that conversation yet. And she said, oh, well, she's married. And actually, I've got a couple of friends who are bisexual, who are females who are married to men, but they're bisexual, and they get really frustrated that their identity is invisible, that they're just assumed to always be heterosexual because they're married to a man. And I said, well, actually, we don't know. It's like, you know, it's a high likelihood, but we might need to ask what her sexual orientation is just because she's married. Assuming people aren't managing self-care is they're not wearing bras. In my experience, it's usually the case, but I do also know people who choose not to wear bras. So just checking out, what would you previously have done? You know, is this what you normally do? And if they say no, we might need to put in support around self-care. Asking men with tremor if they're managing their sexual needs, but not women. Asking young people about their sexual needs, but not a 70-year-old. A case recently that thinking that someone with an intellectual difficulty, a cognitive impairment, had been in situations because they didn't understand what they were doing, they were misguided, rather than someone with a cognitive impairment might still have sexual capacity and be making choices that are not in line with the law. So we can't assume there. Recently, a female client told a staff member that a young male client had kind of made it clear that he was interested. He didn't do anything inappropriate, he just made it clear he was interested. And the response from the staff was, oh, but he's so cute. And the client did quite well of calling out the staff member and saying, no, he was creepy. I didn't like this interaction. So sometimes our automatic responses, we need to be careful of them. And as I said, timing, you know, we might not be focusing on this early on, but do we ever get around to asking it? And I absolutely am thinking of cases that I've just gone, oh God, I've not actually looked at this with someone. Time's gone on. And just thinking, how do we make sure we don't lose those opportunities? Next slide, please. So, do we have training on this? Do we repeat it over time? Whose job is this? It's everyone's job, but do we need an allocated person or to embed it into certain tasks? Is it good to have it in a case manager's immediate needs assessment form, into our admissions, our health checks, psychology reviews, to ensure we're asking the questions over time? How do they feel about it? It can help if we normalise, help people find ways to talk about it. So building it into structured health questionnaires. I like to ask permission. I might say, oh, my next question's a bit personal, but actually, would it be okay if I ask you about how your sexual needs are at the moment? So we can ask permission. We can phrase it as saying, this may or may not be relevant to you, but some people with brain injuries can experience changes in their erectile functioning after an injury. And I just want to check out if you've got any needs in this area. And some people find physically it's all working okay, but it's just hard to meet people now. How are things relationship-wise for you? And sometimes when you kind of give people that way of asking those questions, they feel more confident and going, oh yeah, that doesn't feel inappropriate, that feels okay. Next slide, please. I would also say that just because sexual capacity is very specific and quite low bar, it doesn't mean we can't go beyond that. And there's a lovely paper, I'm happy to forward it, by Camilla Herbert and Palmer from the Disabilities Trust, that some work they did around a person-centred holistic model. And it's a really nice considering of the person's relationship experiences, is their history of power imbalances, coping skills, issues of morality, their disability, looking at their wider disability like social cognition, their knowledge of the facts, their choice, any concerns around suggestibility, their ability to ask staff for support, organisation factors, you know, is there staff attitudes and beliefs? Family, environmental factors. Are we putting single beds into an environment that we're put a 40-year-old in to live for the rest of their life? I wouldn't be too happy living like that. I like it. I'm going king size bed, to be honest. But you know, what message are we saying when we put a single bed everywhere in? What message do we have when people just don't knock on a door and walk straight into bedrooms? So there might be environmental reasons we need to think about as well. Next slide, please. And I'd also recommend this tool. This is by Build. They're a learning disability support system. You can find them on the internet, and they provide this really useful framework. There's a structured interview to talk you through how to do a capacity assessment, but also they go beyond the basics and look at things like power imbalances in relationships. It's only 30 quid for the manual, but they send you a CD with lots of images. They're very graphic, but they need to be. So they help you have images to assess someone's understanding of anatomy and sexual acts from all sexual orientations. And they've also got images that you can use to look at people's ability to understand power dynamics. So for instance, as a woman hitting a man, can someone look at that and understand what's going on and that's wrong? I used this pack with a woman yesterday, and she looked at a picture of a man raping a woman, and it was clear the man was raping the woman, but she couldn't identify. She just thought he was kissing her. You know, she couldn't see the facial expressions at all. She couldn't identify anything. So that can be a really useful resource for people to buy. Next slide, please. And there can be, as I said, a difference between someone having capacity for decision but needing support to sort the practicalities out. So we can look at someone's ability to use condoms, for instance. We might separate that out for the capacity assessment. You can ask permission. People are often really happy to do this. They don't mind. And you can use a banana. I've got a 10 quid condom demonstrator I bought off the internet. My client Lydia, she's named it Pablo. We have an absolute laugh doing this stuff. But a couple of sessions can really improve ability on this, and you can do a support plan. You know, someone may think that they can say, oh, I'd use the pill. My client yesterday was saying, I'd just use the pill, I'd go to the GP. This woman can't get herself washed and dressed. She can't manage her own continence right now. There's no way she could actually even go to the GP or remember to take medication. So we could have a support plan around that. My top tip is tell your cleaner what you're up to. My office from yesterday smells of spermicide and has an awful lot of condoms in my office bin. So, you know, just let people know what you're doing here if you can. Next slide, please. And it's okay for sexual needs to be a rehab goal. What a great rehab goal, I would say. So, sorry, I'm just going to have some water. Lydia's given permission to share this with you today. She's a lady who's currently with us, Daniel Yorath. 2020, she had a hypoxic brain injury after an overdose, and she struggles with her memory, her vision, apraxia, and bilateral limb coordination. And Lydia's vocation is being a sex worker, and she loves her work, and she's very keen to return to it. It's really important to her identity and her ability to be financially independent. And I asked permission just to have a frank discussion regarding her work. I said, is it okay that can I ask you some really frank questions? And she said, absolutely. And we identified what she needed to overcome some barriers to her returning to work. And she needed to be able to put condoms on because she can't trust a man to do that. She has to know for her own protection that that condom is on. So she wants to do it. She has to be able to go into a cafe or bar because she likes to meet people for a first date before anything else happens. But for as part of that, she wants to be able to navigate the environment. So she wants to be able to find a table and find the toilet. She needs to be able to call a taxi and use it to get the bar. She wants to practice sex. We have agreed she's going to take the lead on that post-COVID, and we've got a plan around that. But for obvious reasons, I will not be involved in that side of it. And she's got a plan around a PA to book and monitor appointments in the future. Recent changes to case law mean that that might be now permissible. It wouldn't have been previously, and I'll cover that soon. I do not have any special skill sets in this. I have no knowledge on the sex industry or sex really, just normal knowledge. And we simply used our rehab skills that when clients bring a problem to us, we have some really good skills at breaking it down, putting it into separate achievable steps and goal planning and helping them overcome, helping them with memory aids to reach that goal. And it's the same set of skills we can apply to rehab for sexual needs. There have been concerns that should she return to this job, she might be at higher risk. But these are her choices and she's got capacity around that. So sometimes I think actually Lydia might need to give this all a go to find out that some things might be more challenging than she's anticipating. And that's a journey she'll go on. But we can support her like any vocational rehab on that journey. Next slide, please. So our clients might need help and want help on generating solutions of how to meet people. They may want help practicing their social skills, finding accessible options. They might need a pub that's wheelchair accessible, understanding social norms, ways to keep themselves safe, help managing their social presentation and hygiene. I have previously said to people, if you want to start dating, you're going to have to clean your teeth more often. And it can be a useful motivation to get people involved in managing their care a bit more. Next slide, please. It's worth bearing in mind that we might have a role of being an advocate in helping people access their healthcare. So very recent research by the Cervical Cancer Trust found 88% of women with a physical disability had barriers to cervical screening, and half said they didn't attend in future due to prior bad experiences. Many said that there was stigma as they were assumed not to be sexually active because of their disability. And Fee's comment here, I felt like I was being guilt-tripped into dropping my pursuit of accessing routine screening that all other women have access to. So we could maybe have a role sometimes of advocates in helping people access what they should be entitled to. Next slide, please. I did a bit of research for today's talk. I had not previously known about Dallas Novelty. Don't click on the site if you don't want to see explicit images, but they specialise in sex aids for disabled people that take into account issues like someone may have weaknesses in their hands or no hand ability at all. So there's another resource for you. And the BPS note that we should support people with sexual needs like masturbation when required in accordance with social norms, and we should consider risk of harm due to ineffective technique. I can remember a case of a young man with learning disability who's putting himself at risk of suffocation because he was engaging in autoeroticism by putting his face in a pillow to reduce his oxygen intake when masturbating. And he was at risk of suffocating, and he didn't know how to masturbate, so the interventions were to teach him that. The guidance is that we can use pictures, diagrams, models as part of this, but we should never use touching. Hopefully that's obvious why. And we need to ensure that people with a disability are not overly restricted from accessing their own genitalia. So we can do support around this as well, cautiously. Next slide, please. And what about clients who ask for support to access a sex worker to meet their sexual needs? Well, it's long-standing that we should support our clients to access options like porn, vibrators or other sexual needs. But not everybody knows it's legal for a sex worker to go into a care home or private home, so that includes our rehab unit. But it is not legal to have more than one sex worker in the home at any one time, or two different sex workers visiting the same home. That would classify it as a brothel. Historically, his carers or professionals cannot set this up. So I've quite a couple of times come across clients who wanted this, but because they were unable to set this up themselves, we couldn't progress with this any further. Because under the Sexual Offences Act, a care worker who intentionally causes or incites someone in their care with a mental disorder to engage in sexual activity can be jailed. So currently you can still support this if the person can set this up, or sometimes family manage that aspect of it. But recently this changed. So next slide, please. So in this case, P did not have capacity for many decisions, but he'd expressed a wish to have sex, and he realised that this would need to be through a sex worker. That was his option on the cards. It was agreed by everyone he had capacity to engage in sexual relationships and to decide to be with a sex worker. And it went to the Court of Protection because they wanted clarity of whether a care plan facilitating this would be lawful and within his best interests. And Justice Hayden ruled that the Act is structured to protect vulnerable adults from others, not from themselves, and that people with disability have effectively been prevented by the law from engaging in sexual relationships, and it's legitimate for carers to support these needs if it's clear the client has capacity and it's their choice. So it's legal for any one of us to access a sex worker if we wish, to have a sex worker come into our home, but because our clients might need support facilitating that, they've been prevented from accessing that. And in the same way we might support people to access the supermarket and do their shopping, that this is another need that as long as they're consenting and it's what they want and they have capacity, that Justice Hayden says we can support this. Please note that Robert Buckland, the Justice Secretary, has been granted leave to appeal this decision, so we do need to keep an eye in case this changes over time. Next slide, please. So capacity to decide to pay a sex worker means awareness that the sex worker is offering a service as part of a job, and that this is a limited thing, that you need to pay them for this work, that they will not want a relationship with you, that you will be expected to use a condom, that you can change your mind, and you need to be careful about who you talk to about sex workers. Some people might disapprove. And the British Psychological Society notes that sex workers would routinely not consider their clients' capacity, and I think there is a role for professionals here of supporting this. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this change to one of our managers and she went, oh my goodness, I wouldn't know where to start. And I think that's maybe not an unusual thing to have as an automatic response. Next slide, please. And I thought, one of the things that people may not be aware of is there's an organisation called Tender Loving Care Trust. It's a not-for-profit organisation run by volunteers. Their website address is there if you want to have a look at it. They started in 2000 at a conference when a disabled man spoke about his sadness about being a virgin in his mid-40s. And my understanding is he immediately had multiple offers to address his sad state of affairs. But following this, he joined up with Dr. Toppy Owens and they created a website and it aims to put disabled people in touch with sex workers. So it's specifically for people and only for people with disabilities to access sex workers who only in turn work with people with disabilities. And you can book appointments by the site. It's got very clear financial information of how much appointments cost and who the people are. You must be 18 plus. Sex workers are not DBS checked. It's not easy to get references in the sex work industry. So they do have a system of vetting people. They do the best they can within the system. Next slide, please. It occurred to me that if my clients haven't been able to access sex workers, I just wondered, are sex workers knowledgeable about my clients' needs? And I had a look at the TLC website because they've got all the profiles for the workers on the website. Don't go and look at this if you're easily offended. I'll give you a warning now. I had an education. They list what they do, but they also list the conditions and disabilities they work with. And I've lifted this off the website. So one of the sex workers lists this as an extensive list of things that they're happy to work with. Continence, lack of sensation, motor control, stomas, amputees. But I looked at several profiles and none of them listed brain injury. It's quite interesting. Next slide, please. So I set up a chat with one of the workers, Beverly from TLC, and she specialises in therapeutic sex. And it was interesting because I didn't really know anything about sex work, and I think many people might not know much about it and have preconceptions of what it might involve, and I was astounded at the therapeutic component of her work. I asked her about the profiles not mentioning brain injury, and her thoughts were that maybe they don't work often with people with brain injury, not thought of listing it, but they would be very happy to work with it. They also might be a bit unsure about some of the complexities and capacity issues, and she said no, none of them have really had training in brain injury. Next slide, please. She said her only brain injury client recently, she's not progressed, they had an internet conversation and she will not meet with this man because he made her uncomfortable. This gentleman told Bev that he has a solicitor, and Bev said to me, if he has a solicitor, he clearly has issues with capacity. And I was astounded because I think sometimes our knowledge on capacity we take for granted. And I told Bev about what sexual capacity is, and actually loads of people have solicitors because of medical legal. What I said, what it means to me is he's probably having a medical legal case, but it doesn't mean he's not got capacity. He just might have a solicitor involved in his care. But this gentleman has sent her inappropriate pictures, which is not okay. And I said he may struggle managing his boundaries. He may be disinhibited. You may need to be careful that if he can't manage his interactions on the internet, whether you want to go further with this. And Bev says, I'm not a restaurant, you don't order from me. It's more we are in a consensual relationship together. I don't want him imposing dick pictures to me. Next slide, please. And Bev said, until you can respect my no, I don't want to work with you. And she described something she does with all her clients. She called it the yes-no game. And she said it's really important to her that she makes sure that people can say yes and no to her, and they respect her yes and no before she goes any further. Because she says, if I just say to someone, is there anything I can't do to you? They'll go, no, 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 you can do anything, it's fine. And she doesn't know if they can say no. And she doesn't know if they'll listen to her. So she asks them set things. She says, can I kiss you? And they'll go, yes, yes, of course. Can we have sex? Yes, yes, of course. Can I lick your fingers? Yes. Can I bite your fingers till they bleed? And they go, no, you can't do that. And she goes, great. So there's things I can't do to you. So she knows there's things they'll say no to. And she asks them to do the same thing to her. And there'll be things that she says no to. And she wants them to understand that that means a no. So she explicitly looks at someone's ability to consent, in a sense, around sexual acts. Next slide, please. Bev and I agreed that if client gives permission, it would be really helpful for professionals involved with the client and sex workers to have a chat, to explain a bit about someone's brain injury and any support needs they might have, to clarify their capacity for sex, that they might have support needs even if they have capacity for sex, that they might be verbally disinhibited but might the opportunity to have a consensual experience, that there might need clear boundaries and explanations for all parties. We might need to support our client to understand that the sex work, they can ask for things, but the sex worker can say no, that this is a financial exchange. And there could be behavioural goals for rehab before anything could proceed any further. If a client, for instance, if our client is being sexually disinhibited in the unit and touching care workers and not understanding that norm, you could say, I think it's reasonable to say to them, look, until you can manage this behaviour, it wouldn't be safe for a sex worker to be working with you. So we could link it into some goals in that way. Next slide, please. So this is a consensual relationship that requires consent and respect from both parties. It's worth considering how the person prefers to be paid. Bev said she likes bank transfer. My clients cannot all manage bank transfers. They would need support around that. Bev hadn't considered that there could be a situation where someone might have capacity for sex, but not their finances. It hadn't occurred to her, and we might need to put support around that side of it. She gives receipts. That didn't occur to me that she would, but that could be really useful if someone's got a financial deputy. And she told me that her boundaries are different for different clients. If she's less comfortable with someone, she has higher boundaries, and she has that right to decide. Next slide, please. How do we set this up well? What sort of beds have we got? Bev pointed out that medical beds are not sexy and profiling beds are apparently a complete nightmare for sex. What messages are we sending in our settings? Do we need an alternative? Are staff supported with how to manage this? Bev said, for some clients, they're so professional. I really appreciate it when carers are like that. I've had the opposite. When I'm leaving, it's wink, wink. She's not comfortable with that. It makes her feel like something that's dirty. So it's really important our carers are interacting in an appropriate professional manner. Does your client want privacy? Bev said it's really useful if she knows there's a story because the client doesn't want all the other service users knowing who she is. So if she needs to pretend that she's someone's cousin arriving for a visit, tell her that. And she says, what's your client expecting to happen? She says often people think they want sex, but they want cuddling, intimacy, they want touch. Our clients are probably have the most touch of any, there's so much touch in their care, and actually sometimes so little intimacy touch through their lives. You know, so sometimes they just want to be held. Next slide, please. This is some recommended watching. This is free to watch. It's an hour documentary on YouTube. You will get a warning that it's graphic. It is not, in my view, particularly graphic. There's 2 instances you see someone's breasts, but there's no showing of sex or anything like that in this video, and it's a fascinating documentary. And this is a documentary about a sex worker in Australia who has set up a company that supports people specifically with disabilities. And her name's Rachel, and she's got some amazing input from mothers of clients, the clients themselves, and the sex workers talking about their real experiences of this work. And Mark is featured in this. Mark is non-verbal. He communicates with a synthetic voice when he types out the letters, letter by letter. And he said, it's been my dream to have a woman stay in my bed overnight. It's something that other people get to enjoy and share. Next slide, please. As part of him achieving this dream, Rachel here, the sex worker, Rachel got training in how to feed him because he can't feed himself. She got training in how to use his hoist so she could assist him into bed at night so she could stay the night with him. And there's a picture here of Rachel and Mark communicating in bed through an alphabet chart. This is not my preconceived idea of a sex worker. It may not be yours, and I guess it might not be what we're expecting. And you can see here that he's having a chance to have an exchange with someone in a way that is appropriate for his needs. So I just wanted to share some images from that documentary and would highly recommend it. Next slide, please. Bev suggested we think about support afterwards. I hadn't thought of this. She said when clients lose their virginity, they can be so excited they tell everyone. Not everyone wants to hear. It's important to consider the consent of carers to listen and respect that. And she said she likes to ask people what they're doing after. Can they spend time with someone they trust? Have they got someone who is happy to share with them their experience? Many people growing up, when they have sexual experiences, they talk to their friends about that. And our clients may not have that network to talk to. So their carers might be the people around them, but carers may not want all the details, or the client might be disinhibited. So there might be a support need there. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to move on to our last topic for today, of thinking about issues relevant to young people, in particular in transitioning ages. Next slide, please. So age of injury matters in this. An adult often has prior knowledge and experiences of sex to draw upon, but a younger person, especially with a more severe brain injury, may be more likely to not have had sex education, or education in a manner they could retain or understand. So if a client may need to have enabled capacity for sex, we may need to do some sex education before someone has capacity around it. And it's worth thinking, whose role is that? Because often when I've been in these situations, people feel uncomfortable and say, oh, well, we're not sex educators. Who would do that? And I would say it doesn't matter as long as one of the professionals do it. SLTs, nurses, OTs, case managers, assistant sites, neuropsychs, between us, we've got a huge amount of skills in simplifying information and teaching in a manner that can be understood by people with cognitive impairment. And we can apply that to areas our clients need to be supported with. And in the same way we break down a personal care routine, we might need to break down something on this. Next slide, please. So as a case example, I was working with a 13-year-old woman, G, who had very severe cognitive and communication impairments. And when she had started her periods, she was put on the contraceptive pill continuously because she had freaked out. By continuously, normally if someone's on the pill, they take it for 3 weeks and they have a week break with no pill, and they have a period during that week. But if you take it continuously, you never have you don't ever stop taking the pill, and you generally don't have periods. But nobody had really considered the health risks. So there's health risks for women who take the pill, including things like stroke, and the health risks are higher if you don't have that week break. Nobody had actually ever given her sex education. And by sex education, that's a broad term. No one had educated her about menstrual cycles and using products for that. And actually, when I talked to her primary carer on this, she'd had breakthrough bleeding for years, spotting, and she'd coped well with it. So I said maybe she's older, with support, with education, she could cope. Discussed it with her mother and the staff team who were up for trying it. And I designed, so again, no experience in sex ed, but designed a bit of education that was simplified, appropriate for her, around that she would shortly start her periods, and that these are products that we could use. We had to look at the products, involved her key worker in that. And we successfully took off the pill, and it was like nothing had happened, to be honest. She was fine off it. So we can do some work around these things. Next slide, please. It's also worth, if you're working with young people, being aware of something called the Gillick competence. And this is a term from medical law to decide whether a child, that's classed as under 16 years of age, is able to consent to their own medical treatment without the need for parental permission or knowledge. Next slide, please. So there's no lower limit for that. It is deemed as it's under 16, so 16 and 17-year-olds are usually considered able to consent for most things. That's slightly changed recently. Puberty blockers, they were deemed not to have capacity, but in general, 16 and 17-year-olds are deemed to have capacity consent for things. So that's under 18. We need to be aware of that, this idea that 18 at all shifts. Please note, Gillick is about capacity to consent. It does not cover any restrictions of liberties if the person lacks capacity around medical issues. But medical issues includes choices around their sexual health and contraception. So we might well have a young person, it could be a 15-year-old who is Gillick competent and is accessing contraception through the GP. Next slide, please. What about restrictions? In supporting people with complex needs, we often make best interest decisions and put restrictions in. And often we do that around the DOLS framework, which gives us checks, so are we doing the right thing, and gives legal authority for those restrictions. Well, when DOLS came in, it was only 18 plus, and the idea was that anyone under 18, parental authority was deemed adequate for restrictions. And then Lady Hill struck again. So you may well be familiar from Lady Hill. She is led in the Cheshire West case, who said a gilded cage is still a cage, and turned that all upside down on dolls. I think she's rather awesome, as you might have guessed, that recently described as utterly badass around the prorogation of Parliament. But in this case, it was the same. She said it's the same principles as with Cheshire West. She said parents can't authorise restrictions that go beyond what's normally typical for parental authority. So now, I was working with a 16-year-old who was in his own home, had carers 24 hours a day, 2 carers. Up to that point, that was legitimate because his mother agreed, and beyond that point, it should have gone to the Court of Protection. It can't be under the TOLS framework, it has to be under the Court Protection. That will change shortly because the Liberty Protection Safeguards is due to apply to 16 plus. But we are in a position where parents do not have the right to restrict their children's dating and sexual activity beyond what would normally be typical. What normally is typical is, I'm not sure what that is, and that could be up for debate. But we just need to bear in mind that this framework is relevant and restrictions would need to be via the Court of Protection currently. Next slide, please. So in this, the judging came from this case in 2019. So it's always been commonplace. It was with this gentleman D that his restrictions would have been a deprivation of liberty if not for his parents' consent to them. He was living in a large house in his own grounds. He had with other people. The doors were locked. If he wanted to go into the garden, he had to ask for it to be unlocked. He could not leave the premises except for planned activity. Certainly for adults, we would view this as a deprivation of liberty. Next slide, please. Although I mentioned Lady Hale, Lady Black was also involved in this case. She said that the Gillett case is not directly relevant to the issue before us. It has to do with medical treatment and not with deprivation of liberty. And an adult in the exercise of parental responsibility may impose or may authorise others to impose restrictions on the liberty of a child. However, restrictions so imposed must not in their totality amount to a deprivation of liberty. You know, that people's human rights remain and parents can't overrule their human rights here. Next slide, please. So just to finish up today, I've got a list of some useful reading I would recommend. NICE have published a really good guide to assessing capacity generally, as have 39 Essex Chambers. Theirs is fantastic because in that guide they set out for a lot of decisions what is and is not relevant for many capacity assessments. The British Psychology Society guidance on particular sexual relations is really useful for this field. There's some interesting ones on social workers for brain injury, and if anyone is interested in things like the frontal lobe paradox I mentioned got a paper there. They are all free guidance that you can download off the internet. SWADRSET also provide guidance on supporting people with disability to access their health needs, and there's a link for the documentary I mentioned. 2 things I did forget to write down there, 2 books I would recommend. There's a book by Tracy Rees-Morgan on assessing capacity generally, and another recent book on capacity assessments by Janice McKenzie and Kate Wilkinson is absolutely excellent, with chapters on sexual capacity, among other things, and I would recommend those. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for listening. I've given both my email addresses. You feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions, but I think we've got a bit of time now for questions as well. Is that right, Stephen?
I think that's right. Thanks for that, Catriona. That's been a very wide-ranging discussion on all the issues, and it's particularly interesting to see it's all applied in a clinical way. There's been a few questions on the question and answer, but there's just a couple of points I was just going to mention which flow from that talk from a legal perspective. I thought I'd go through first. The first is the JB case, which is the one setting out the updated test on sexual capacity. And I think the important point for you to note on that is that the official solicitor has been given leave to appeal that. So that's going to go to the Supreme Court. So that, I think, is not going to be the end of the matter on what the test on sexual capacity should be. And now I haven't seen the grounds of appeal, but I think I broadly have a sort of view of what they may be based on what some of the arguments the official solicitor was raising in the case. And they will be things like this is potentially setting the bar too high. bringing in the element of consent from the other parties, potentially bringing in a person-specific element of this, which the court has always flatly refused in the past, saying it should be a general test, and also that it's trespassing too much on some of the criminal law issues, which was sort of the balancing act that the court was trying to find its way through in the judgment. So I do think this is going to be developed further in the case law. So this is the law as it stands now, but it may well change. And the second point really flows from the bit about sexual relations and capacity on contact. And it was rightly said that these are decision-specific issues which need to be assessed as such. So I think it was the TZ case was mentioned where the client was found to have capacity to consent to sexual relations, but not to have capacity to make decisions about contact. And contact was restricted to some extent on that basis with potential sexual partners. And what I wanted to say about that is that if you have cases where that is an issue, where you think your client may have capacity to consent to sexual relations but may lack it in respect of contact because of potential risky partners or whatever it may be, those cases must go to the Court of Protection. There's no two ways about it, because it's a serious infringement of someone's Article 5 and 8 rights. And actually, there has been a case called Manchester and LC a few years ago, which said that those cases are so complicated because they're involving mixed capacity that not only do they need to be in the Court of Protection, they also need to be dealt with by a High Court judge in the Court of Protection. Now, that's not being followed through to the letter on all the cases where I've had these issues arise, but it really is worth your while knowing that they really should be referred to court where those sorts of issues crop up. So if I may, I might start just going through some of the questions on the Q&A, and I'm going to call on Catriona and one or two others to help me with one or two of them, if that's okay. But the first one is in relation to the relevance of laws to people in Scotland, and is this just applying to English law? Well, the answer to that in short terms is that this is just the law of England and Wales we're talking about. So these Court of Protection decisions apply to clients in England and Wales, and Scotland, of course, has its own jurisdiction, and they do things quite differently in Scottish law. I have in the past acted for Scottish local authorities who have placed clients in England, and those sorts of cases can be quite interesting because you can have issues about habitual residence and also the extent to which all the elements of the English law should apply. So you can have jurisdictional issues that flow from cross-border placements. But in broad terms, what you need to know is this is the law of England and Wales we're referring to here. The second question is about people who are below 16 years of age and discovering their sexuality, and how they should be supported in the same way, whether they have a brain injury or not. And I must say, I think this is probably a little bit out with my expertise. So I don't know if Catriona, you've seen that question and whether...
I can't see any questions, Stephen.
Right.
Can you either read them to me, or I don't know if you can give me...
They should be in the normal chat as well.
Yeah, I can't see an option to bring up the chat for some reason.
Well, not to worry. Shall I just read it out? And
yeah, if you can.
If you're able to offer a bit of assistance, that would be good. So it says, most of us would acknowledge that young people under the age of 16 are discovering their own sexuality and may be accessing sexual content. So while this is deemed normal for someone who is without an acquired brain injury, how do we ensure that someone with an acquired brain injury is regarded in the same way and supported to undertake this important part of their physical and psychological development? So it's children under 16, I suppose, and making sure they're supported in the same way if they've got a brain injury. I suppose it's if anything, access to the same sort of sexual education they might need. That's the only thing I can really think about as far as that's concerned.
And I think having those conversations of saying, is this something you want to talk to us about? They may not want to. They may say, I don't want to go there at all. But is there anything that they're needing support with? Yeah, and I think it's very hard without a case-specific example, isn't it? But I think just talking about this and for it to be an allowable discussion, an allowable support need, the person may say that actually the first stage might be helping them make friendships. They want to meet people. There's specific websites for people with intellectual disabilities on meeting people. I think it's harder for people with brain injuries, and it can be really difficult. But is the core issue here? The person wants to get to know people, so we could think on building those opportunities and into their day. What are some of the barriers around that? Is it that they find it hard to think of things to ask? Do we need to maybe help them with their social skills for those things? We can't magically force those scenarios. We can't create dating and friends, but we can help recognise it as something that we're willing to support with and needs around that, and look at overcoming barriers to as far as possible within it. And I guess regarding identity, what is the nature of the sex education they've had? How often do people assume, oh, are you wanting a boyfriend? Are you wanting a girlfriend? Sometimes our language is not actually that inclusive. Have we been open and always talking about you might want a boyfriend or a girlfriend at some point? So I think just kind of, have we made it possible for someone to acknowledge their sexual identity? Do we need to help them access support groups? For instance, if someone was saying, I feel like I might be trans, I wouldn't have a clue, but can I help a trans group give information in an accessible way for my client? So we might have a facilitatory role there.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, and then we've got another question here, which is that anecdotal evidence suggests that LGBT young people's relationships are much more heavily scrutinised by professionals and often seen as being more risky. And how do we address these prejudices when supporting clients? And I think my colleague Lucy, who's also on the panel, had a potential answer with reference to cases on this area.
Hello everybody. Yes, there is a recent case. I don't have one specific to LGBTQ, but I do have a case that is equally helpful. So the starting position when dealing with this sort of issue is to remind yourself that if this was ever to go to the Court of Protection, you're looking at it from a Mental Capacity Act point of view, that the court is not going to be substituting its own values and priorities that they think is important. So that you have to take a very neutral position, and any clinicians dealing with these types of assessments need to make sure that they do that. The case I had in mind was a local authority, and which is small b, RS, that's Romeo Sierra, square brackets 2020, capital E, capital W, capital C, capital O, capital P, 29. It's a gentleman who has a mild learning disability with autism, but has a desire to act out baby adult fetish scenarios, and there were concerns raised that he was pursuing this on the internet, which was leading him to engage in risky behaviours, including meeting men on the internet. And what it was held at paragraph 42 was that the risky behaviour is not inevitably evidence of a failure to understand the risk, or being evidence of an inability to weigh that risk when deciding whether or not to act on that desire. So you have to go right back to the Mental Capacity Act and be aware of that principle of an unwise decision is not necessarily an indication of lacking capacity. And this, when it was scrutinised by the Court of Protection, was under, the expert was cross-examined, and there were 6 key points. And as a clinician or anyone looking at assessments needs to bear in mind these 6 points. So it's important not to use risky behaviours to justify an assessment of lacking capacity. You know, a person is presumed to have capacity, so just because somebody's engaging in those risky behaviours doesn't therefore mean that you should go ahead and do a capacity assessment. Consideration also needs to be given to the level of maturity and also the actual age of that person, and give more weight appropriately in line with how old that person is against that decision that's deemed unwise. Also, caution is also needed to be given when potentially you're going to be making a mistake of attributing that person's impulsive decision is as a result of their LD. So you need to make sure you're not simply equating learning disability as, oh, that's why he's making an unwise decision. So I keep saying he or she, but this case is a man. And also autism as well. And then also look at the elements of that person's personal history. You know, look back and see, is there a reason why they're showing this predilection, this desire to act out certain things. Now, that's going to be key, because a distinction needs to be made around that conduct. Is it basically a young person wanting to explore, as Catriona explained it, but you know, clearly we've all made mistakes, we've all made choices that are unwise, and a lot of that is in our youth. You know, you sow your wild oats, if I can use a really old-fashioned phrase. So it's really important that we make sure that it's not simply a case of ordinary recklessness. Number 4, again, the sexual desire is a powerful, quote, driving force, unquote, behind the fetish. So you have to look at that as well. Number 5, you can't be too judgmental and think about, well, is this an abnormal level of impulsivity, because it is different for different people. So context and background of that person is going to be absolutely critical. And just to take away point 6 is that although the possibility of a link between autism and the learning disability and that reckless behaviour in decision making, although that's not, you know, that can't be completely ruled out, you have to keep in mind whether that decision could represent a normal level of impulsivity and recklessness for a person of a similar age. So don't, you know, I'm not saying you can't necessarily rule out the link with the learning disability and autism, but again, reflect on that individual circumstances, their age. And a really interesting point for current context was at paragraph 5, where the judge said the behaviour of this person in meeting up with strangers only after limited contact with them online, which the local authority seeks to characterise as so fundamentally irrational that it must demonstrate RS's lack of capacity, is now also the basis of some widely used social media applications. So Grindr is your gay app to go to if you want to hook up with someone, if you want to go cruising. You know, that could very well be the same matter situation arises for your client. So that's what the judge is saying, is that we can't sit on the moral high grounds and judge them too harshly when, but for their learning disability autism, they would probably be using Grindr anyway. So I hope that case provides some context for that type of scenario.
Thank you. I think the broad point is that the framework of the MCA applies to everyone and is not discriminatory in any way. So each case just needs to be looked at on its own facts. I think, folks, we are coming towards the end, so I think it might be sensible for me to start wrapping up, if that's okay. I think there's one more question about whether you can get a copy of the slides, which I understand the answer to that is yes. It's going to be coming out, I think this is right, as something called a turtle document after the next webinar on the 7th of July. And the next webinar is the teenage behaviour and acquired brain injury one that we're doing. So if I may, I'll draw things to a close. So thank you very much, Catriona, for that very lengthy discussion. I hope that's been of use to you. Couple of things. We have the question and answer breakout session after this, which is on a link, I think, on the Q&A function too. So please do join us for that if you're able to, and we can discuss things further there. And also, I think we have some feedback forms as well, which are also on the link on the Q&A function as well. So please do give us your feedback if you could.
Stephen, can you send me the link, because I can't open on this system is not letting me with Teams open the chat function to get the link, but it would be nice to join the Q&A discussion. Yes,
I can, or my colleagues will sort that out urgently. Yes, no, we do want you there.
I thought someone said we were just going to carry on in this group. Is there definitely a separate link? I might have misremembered.
Well, perhaps someone can help me out with that.
Yes, sorry, it's Carolyn here. There should be a separate link, which is in the Q&A chat. It's been posted in there, so you just need to press on there, copy the link and press on there, and it should bring you through to the breakout session, which is at 12:30. So that's now.
Super. So we all log off now and then log back in on the new link. Yeah. Okay. Well, given it's 12:30, I think we will call it a day for now, but we'll see you very shortly on the new link for the breakout session. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.